Hello and welcome to the August 2019 Sunshine Summit. My name is Heather and I am your host. This week is a week of live streams bringing to you people that we are celebrating connections with, and I am grateful to be joined today by Dave Lee, who is co-host of the Waves of Tech podcast and co-founder of the International Podcast Day. Exciting to have you here, Dave. Welcome.
How's it going? Good to be here. Thank you for the invitation, where we celebrate connections, and there's a lot going on in the podcast space to celebrate. So I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. And we also have some great people in the live chat already. We have Steph from all of the projects that she does, GeoExpats, I think she's got, and American Liberty. And we also have Steve Lee in the chat. Hey, Steve, and Mark and Tim. Welcome, everybody. So today is day 2 of the Sunshine Summit. And Dave, you and I connected last year around podcasting things and International Podcast Day, which was really exciting because I found that sort of in my first year of podcasting, and it was exciting for me that there is this event to celebrate the power of podcastings and the connections that we make through it. So if you wanted to talk a little bit first about the Waves of Tech podcast, I know that I've just introduced International Podcast Day, but the Waves of Tech that you do with Steve.
Yeah, absolutely. The Waves of Tech is a podcast that Steve, who's also my father, so it's my father and I, and in fact, my brother, originally back in March 1st, 2007, was our very first podcast release that we did. So we've been doing it for about 12 years now. And so really the way this podcast started was really a way to stay in touch on Skype, because our family was sort of spanned and across the state of California. It was a way for us to keep in touch. So weekly we would get together on Skype, talk about work, talk about family. And eventually what happened is, because Steve and my brother Mike worked in the technology field, the conversations always went towards technology. And I, for one, was not that into it. I didn't know much about it. And so one day Steve just hit record on his end, did not tell Mike or myself that we were doing it. And he sent us the audio file the next day. He was like, "Hey guys, I've heard about these things called podcasts. Let's do one." And that's how it was essentially born. And so from 2007, we have turned what just became Staying in Touch with Family into nearly 500 episodes. We've had several amazing guests. We've gone through a string of conferences, anywhere from Blog World to podcast conferences to a lot of local tech meetups and conferences in that respect. And that's also led into 5 nominations in the technology category, the Podcast Awards. And so what our show is, The Waves of Tech, it's a tech variety, tech grab bag style podcast. So every week we are going to cover the spectrum of technology. So we're going to be talking about business, media, healthcare, space, cybersecurity. We dive into education, social media. Privacy is a big topic right now. We talk about e-commerce. We dive into aeronautics. So it's really a very wide, diverse sort of template that we talk about there. And so 12 years running, it's a great avenue. Now it's just Steve and I that are doing it, but it's a great show and we love doing it. And week in and week out, we find cool news and notes and really tell you what's going on in the technology world that actually means something to you. It's not overly technical. It's not, it's not in the weeds like programmers or coders or anything like that. It's just what do you need to know as a user and consumer of technology?
That is awesome. And it was also a very big privilege to be a guest on that show with you. And because I had such a lot of fun talking about the off-grid system that I have here, living off the power grid in New Zealand. So it's really awesome how you bring the stories of tech that are relevant and important and that people are curious about and how that impacts them through that podcast. And that's an amazing way of keeping connections going. Like, I think there have been other people who've been on the summit who do that to keep in touch with others and make it their sort of weekly date to catch up with each other. And yeah, I think it's pretty powerful that we can connect wherever we are like this and then share those stories through podcasts. Like Steph said, that was a fun origin story. So
Yeah, it's fun. It's a little bit unique because you don't hear of too many father and sons that are doing podcasting, let alone have done it for 500 episodes and branched off and done International Podcast Day. So it's a really good time for my father and I to connect, and it's been a really good time for even when my brother was on there to dive in and just have another family moment week in and week out. And I think it's one of the fun reasons that we still continue to do the podcast week in and week out.
yeah. And you mentioned briefly there about podcast awards. I see that the Waves of Tech podcast is up for the awards this year. It's in the finalist on the slate, which is very exciting. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Very exciting. Year after year, we always put our name in there. We throw it out to our audience. Again, working on those connections and celebrating as far as our listeners and our friends. And no, I appreciate it because it's always good to be in good company with that final slate of technology podcasters. So maybe one day we'll be able to raise that trophy.
Yeah. There are a lot of great names on there, and some of them I'm not even aware of, but it's a great way to just sort of discover other things as well. And the Podcast Awards happens, or the final event is through International Podcast Day. So if you want to sort of go back to the origin of International Podcast Day and how that came about, that would be amazing.
Absolutely. So again, it goes back to Steve and myself. And so for a little background, International Podcast Day is September 30th. And we originally started the event in 2004 as National Podcast Day. So what we actually did was just here in the United States, we celebrated 6 hours of podcasting with different broadcasts. And we introduced Daniel J. Lewis and we used Ray Ortega and Dave Jackson, just some of our other connections. And that after we heard from the podcast community in 2000, right after that event, we quickly rebranded into International Podcast Day. So between 2015 and 2019 now, we've broadcasted hundreds of hours from around the globe, inviting podcasters and industry professionals from well over 50 different countries. And they've shared their podcast journeys, their personal stories, and their expertise through it. And so it's a really great opportunity for everybody within the space to connect with fellow podcasters, podcast listeners, audio enthusiasts, and leaders in the industry. And the origin story behind that was Steve was in fact driving in his car, listening to radio. And still to this day, I give him a lot of heck for that because like, what are you doing listening to radio? You were into podcasts, man. Stick with your podcast. For whatever reason, his podcast feed was empty. So he hopped on the radio and he heard something for like National Senior Citizens Day on the radio. And he had this like feeling. He's like, why doesn't the podcast industry have its own day? Mm-hmm. So he called me right away. He's like, Dave, I got this crazy idea. Let's create an event, a day-long celebration where we can celebrate podcasts and celebrate the podcasting industry. And so it took us about a year to kind of put everything together, but it was Steve's brainchild. And I had a lot of ideas and concepts, and we worked with who we knew in the space. And that's how it was born. So who knows where your inspiration comes from through podcasts, through events like this. But that is the origin story of International Podcast Day. And year by year, we evolve the event. It changes because the podcast industry changes and evolves as well. So we love the event. We love that it's captured the attention of the podcast industry. And it's just an amazing time to be a part of this event year in and year out.
Yeah. I loved it. Like I said, just coming into podcasting back in 2017, I was so excited that there was this thing that celebrated this this industry, this project, this way of creating something that I was really, really passionate about. And it was amazing to see the people who came by live and did their segments and just the reach it had. But not only that, that there's an encouragement to sort of share the word and celebrate the podcast that you listen to, because the power of podcasting does this amazing thing where we have our own voice and we can use that to share our message through podcasting. And yeah, I think it's just this incredible thing that I'm 100% behind and support and want more people to know about, to get excited about, and to share that as well. And Steve in the chat said he is the better looking Lee.
I can't argue with him. It's yeah, but it's been great, this journey. And I wanted to preface this a little bit by informing everybody September 2004 was essentially the birth of podcasting. And so that's why we've chosen September, and that's why we actually did it September 2014, because that was essentially the 10-year anniversary of the first release of the first podcast. And so there's a little bit more historical context there. So September is very meaningful for our community, and it's very meaningful for the podcast space. And so we wanted to pay a little homage to that. And instead of flexing it and say it's like the last Saturday or it's the first Friday, it's always September 30th. And because of the nature of international podcasting, we actually start celebrating September 29th, because in fact, here in California, where Steve and I are based, it's already September 30th in New Zealand, in Australia, and other places. So we didn't want to not have them involved. So we actually span 2 days now. But September is really vital for the podcasting industry. There's a lot of history there, and that's why we chose September 30th as the date.
That's awesome. American Liberty in the chat asked, what was the most important concept about International Podcast Day? Did you make what something involved in its DNA? Make sure something was in part of its DNA. I think maybe for me that is the core of the power of podcasting. It's kind of like the theme of what you celebrate, but maybe you've got something.
Yeah, the core of International Podcast Day is, one, to celebrate the power of podcasting, celebrate the voices, celebrate spoken word, celebrate collaboration. And that's really what it is. Another sort of pillar we've always had is that we really want to show the true internationality of podcasts, because for a long time, the US, and still is to a large degree, the dominant sector, the dominant force here. But we have amazing growth in India, in Australia, in Brazil. There is so much going on in the European space with France and Poland and Finland. We have, as you know, Podcast Brunch Club is this amazing, podcast club, and they have 65 different chapters around the globe. And so when we looked at sort of the DNA of International Podcast Day, we wanted to celebrate the diversity within the podcasting space. We wanted to celebrate the different voices, and that includes having people provide live speaking and live sessions in their own native tongue. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing that we want to make sure of, is that we don't break the mold of who they are as individuals or who they are as a nation or as a person. And so that has really, Steve and I have really taken heart to that, of making sure that we're highlighting the true internationality that is known as podcasting.
Yeah, they can bring to their segment who they are and what they are sharing in their own words, like you're saying, so in their own languages, and share their messages that are shining a light on them and their space and where they're from. And American Liberty said that's amazing. And I really, truly think it is. It's incredible. And so in order to make these kind of connections, to pull people in to International Podcast Day, how have you found that journey?
The journey it's an interesting journey. I'll start with that, because making connections, just like we all know, it's not, we don't want to overcomplicate it. It's simply just talking, conversating with individuals, but there are some inherent challenges, when it comes to that. There's some language barriers, there's time zone barriers when it comes to how you can communicate, when you can communicate. And really, the things that have really worked as far as making connections through both the podcast, the Waves of Tech, and our International Podcast Day event is really focusing on the individual or the podcast first. I've personally made some mistakes of jumping in with the initiation or the thought that I want them to be a part of my event because they do amazing things, this and that, without really getting to know the person first, right? And I think we've all done that. We say like, oh, you want to listen to podcasts? Here's my podcast. Listen to it. Or, hey, this is what I'm doing. And so instead, making those connections, I've learned to bridge the gap to celebrate what they're doing first and understand what they're working on in the space, whether they're writing books, they're doing live events, whatever it is. And as you said, as you make these connections and you bring them onto our International Podcast Day event, you have to bring them in with the ability to make decisions within that process, right? We're saying you can talk about what you are working on, what's going on in your neck of the woods, what's happening with your podcast workshop. It's all about giving them the power to do that. And I think in relationships and celebrating connections, that's what it's about. It's about looking out for each other. It's about empowering them to contribute in a way that they want to do. And so it's been an interesting, email has been amazingly effective in communications. One thing that I've really known is that I've seen is that in order to make these relationships and connections happen, first and foremost, you really have to invest in other people's work. And that means listening to their podcast, visiting their blogs, reading their show notes, buying their books, attending summits like you're doing right here, Heather, really investing in individuals so that they know that they want to invest in you. And that's reading their journalistic articles that they put together out there. So there's a lot going on in the space that we're trying to balance here.
Yeah, I think the pesky time zones, Liberty said, I mean, it is a challenge for the summit for international podcasting, for even just trying to connect with podcasters if you're a guest on their show outside of that. But I think we are very flexible as podcasters. We are very helpful, and there's a lot of support within the podcasting community. And Steve said it's important to celebrate and share the craft that we love, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. And American Liberty called it the podcast family circle. I think podcasting is this amazing thing that does bring people together, even though we talk about different things and do it from different locations and have different things that we're sharing. We still have this common passion for podcasting itself, and that radiating through, and highlighting and shining a light on what other people do and being invested in them so that they can see the value that you see in them would help them feel on board with what you're doing and bring them on board for International Podcast Day. It's the same with the summit. I kind of get to know all of my guests before I invite them to be a part of it and see what works, and then see how I can spotlight that in a positive way. It's kind of a little bit different because I'm interviewing everyone rather than them sharing on their own. But yeah, I love the opportunity for everyone to get together and around a central date, because it makes it this big celebration and it makes it something to look forward to and to mark on the calendar. And kind of, the anniversary, like my podcast anniversary is going to be tomorrow. I think I launched my podcast 2 years ago tomorrow. And so to be able to celebrate that then, and then again, just the whole space of podcasting next month is very, very cool. In terms of people that you've got on for International Podcast Day this year, are there any stories where you've had how you've reached out to them and brought them on, and where they might be based? Some interesting highlights that you want to share?
Yeah, getting speakers and reaching out to different podcasters, it's different with everybody, because I will say Twitter has been sort of the life breath for our event, and it's been an amazing place to connect with podcasters and just audio enthusiasts in general. And so that is sort of where it was born, and that's where it continues to thrive and develop and grow. And it's a great way, of course, for the buildup of the event, the delivery of the event, for creating those connections. And one of the interesting parts about that is when we go to reach out, everybody, and this is just a point of interest for everybody, is the way people use social media is very differently than, say, the way I use social media. Some people use it just for business. Some people use it for personal. Some people use it just to connect with their listeners. And so when you reach out to the individuals, I always say to DM or not to DM. That is the main question, and it's like sometimes I can sort of tell by their feed. And so you got to get to know the way feeds look and the way people are interacting, whether you want to reach out that way. I've used email, as I mentioned earlier, quite effectively, but then sometimes people don't use email. And so you're trying to balance, okay, do I go to Facebook Messenger? Do I use an Instagram direct message? Am I email? Am I doing Twitter? Is it a possible phone call? Because I've had many phone calls with podcasters, at least based here in the United States, where one of my buddies gave a phone number to somebody else. Hey, give Dave a call. And so we're learning, and that goes for sponsorships and people that want to collaborate. You're going to find that no matter what relationship or connection you're creating, it's going to be very unique to that person and their way of doing things. And in order for your podcast to succeed, for an event to succeed, for businesses to succeed, you have to find that method of communication that works specifically for them. There are people that I have only text messaged back and forth with. There are people that just prefer to stick to emails, and that's it. And you have to learn to adapt to that. Now, it's difficult when it comes to planning and trying to assign your resources to, did I DM this person? Did I email? But that's all on me to take care of, and so that's one of the big ways we've done it. We've actually used Facebook quite well as far as organizing people and creating events. That seems to be a really good method for that. I'm noticing less people here within domestically the United States are using Facebook Messenger, and a lot of the international podcasters are using like WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger as their primary means of communication. So I'm starting to learn boundaries and who does what and which different regions of the world work for what we are trying to do. And so that's just a little bit of a summary of what it's like trying to create. And when it comes to language barriers, you mentioned time zones, which is its own barrier. So there's some people I don't talk to but every 3 or 4 days, and because they're sleeping when I'm awake and I'm awake and they're sleeping, so it goes back and forth. But yeah, language barriers, always try and find somebody if they don't, if they're speaking Spanish or if they're speaking German, try and find somebody that I've connected with previously to try and do some translation or to reach out to them directly and sort of be that connection. So a lot of different caveats when it comes to working with an international space.
Yeah. I think that when you do look at all these different things, it's an incredible sort of experience to have, and the tools that you've got under your belt now, knowing who's from where and what kind of resources they might use. What kind of resources have you connected with in order to help you do International Podcast Day?
Yeah, there's a lot of resources that we use. Steve is actually really good on the back end. So everything that I've done, from the scheduling to all the social media, that's all me. Steve does everything from the website, all the plugins. So from a technical side, I wouldn't be the person to really ask for the resources. Steve is sort of the go-to. But we've used different collaboration tools like Web of Booking for our speaker engagements. And so Steve has worked on that. So everything's form and functional and easy for the broadcasters. We've done a lot of automation tools. We've done some social media scheduling. We have some good automation emails for that. When people contact us, it's directed to Steve or I. There's a lot of PDF things that we send via email just from direct automation. So that's been super helpful. And just as far as resources go, just on the surface level, Google Drive is like one of my favorite things. It keeps me organized. It's a great way of sharing information with speakers. It's a great way of sharing information just in general and storing things. But yeah, resources, it can be a little tough, and but those are sort of like the surface level what we've been using.
Yeah, I like to keep an eye on what other people do and then sort of get ideas from them as well. Like I know that with live streaming, particularly what platforms people use to do that. I'm using a Curran today. We're going through OBS to YouTube Live. There are other ones like StreamYard, I think it's called, and there are all sorts of different ones. So it's kind of fun keeping on top of the tech that is out there to help enable and to do these things. And American Liberty has asked a question. As someone that is clearly successful at organization, are there any time management strategies you employ to balance your ongoing podcast with International Podcast Day?
Absolutely. Time management is a huge thing. And I've always, just on a personal level, like a work-life podcast balance has always been one of my main things. And there's actually an individual by the name of Alex Lauren. He's from Canada, and he's known as the podcaster's coach. And we had him on a couple years ago, and I actually bought his book and read, because it's all about creating balance with your life, with your work, with podcasts and all that stuff. So there are a couple book resources out there that I've read. His book is a really good one. And also, one of the big things with time management is understanding boundaries. There are certain times when I'm at work, I make sure I'm not doing anything podcast relating. And then when I come to work, I dedicate 2 or 3 hours in the evening, especially as we get closer to not only our individual podcast that we're doing, the Waves of Tech, but also the larger international event, where I'm specifically blocking out time to do that. And so I'm able to do 2-3 hours of just focused work on updating the website, contacting individuals, listening to podcasts of individuals that we may want to invite on, and then separating that and saying, okay, now is my family time. And so I don't overcomplicate the time management. I don't use any specific tools like Trello or anything like that, but I designate blocks of time. And I've known personally for me, that is the way I get through the week to week. That is the way I get through the podcast events. And very similar when Steve and I are prepping for the Waves of Tech, I take my time throughout the week to research the articles, do a little background work on our show notes, put some good links in there. And then him and I always have a couple conversations throughout the week on how we want to plan to attack. But it's very choreographed, it's very structured, and just advice for the question right there is just find what works for you. There may be a tool, there may be a resource, but making sure that you are definitely dedicating blocks of time to focus so that you're not distracted with work or with family or with other podcasts and other things that are going on.
Yeah. Steve said critical, share the load with others. And I think that is definitely important because it can be overwhelming and a lot to take on. It's a huge thing to do an event like International Podcast Day. And so you have your roles and what you do to participate and contribute towards that event. But also, yeah, like you said, blocking out time. And it is about finding what works for you. I think that is a tricky thing, but keep trying. If you try something and it doesn't work, let that go and move on and find something else that does work for you. And I know that with the Waves of Tech, do you have a set day and time of recording?
Yeah, we record every Monday evening at 4:30. That 4:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and so that Steve and I, we've been at that schedule for a number of years, and he's right, sharing the load, because there are things that Steve does both with the podcast and International Podcast Day that I don't even want to get close to. That's stuff that I'd be paying for other people to do. And there's stuff that I do like social media, coordinating the schedule, doing various things like that Steve does not want to do. Just we each have our own level of expertise, and that's understanding and being honest with each other as far as that's you, I'm going to do this. And so finding that is really critical. And same thing for our podcast. He does all the post-production. He does a website. I do all the show notes. I do the social media. So it's finding that balance, what works. And I think ultimately, to your point, Heather, it's about finding what works for you. And yeah, sure, go ahead and dive in and work on some post-production. Sure, go ahead if you're not comfortable writing, try some show notes and try and do a little bit of that. But understanding your personal limitations and your technical abilities is really a key thing in moving forward.
Yeah, I agree with that too. Steve has another tool that he said helps. Whiskey helps too, he said.
I do like my scotch, so that's not far from the tree there.
Yeah, limitations, boundaries, blocking out time, all of those things. I think that it's a journey. It's a learning journey. And Bettina and Ninorah, who joined us yesterday, said that they went on a learning journey. They do all of the things themselves, and they learnt how to work with each other in their relationship. And you've obviously done the same thing with your dad, Steve, to work out what both of you are good at and to use those skills where they're most suited. Have you come across any challenges along the way with International Podcast Day or even the Waves of Tech, or just making connections, and how have you worked through those?
Yeah, a lot of challenges with our podcast specifically, and I think a lot of podcasters do this. Is we reach out to individuals to have on our show, and it's finding a balance between wanting to promote something that they're working on or their story or a book or whatever that we find of interest without making it too much of like a sales pitch kind of thing. When we have a guest on, where we want to be perfectly clear in having those conversations with them that it's about delivering a good message. It's not about selling a book. It's not about selling your platform or your app. And I think all podcasters have come across that. And there's been a couple times where Steve and I have like, maybe this isn't the best guest to have on just because of their profile, the way things have been presented in the past, or even we've heard them on other podcasts. And so that's kind of a challenge that you have to work through as a podcaster, making sure that the information and the content you're throwing out through your feed it makes sense for yourself and for what you want to deliver and for your audience as well. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that can sort of fit in with that. Some of the other challenges, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, with our International Podcast Day, we do everything is free of charge. We invite people on. We want people to come on, do their thing, share their message, share their story. And it's a bit of a challenge sometimes when you find somebody that you really want and they're like, okay, here is my price schedule, and I'm like, I can respect that as a professional who is working within a space, who needs obviously to make them income. That makes a lot of sense, but that's a semi-frequent challenge that we have to get to. And just because we are, we don't gross a lot of income from what we do, a lot of it is the side passion kind of things. So we can't really afford to have some of the top-notch, speakers out there to come join us. And we do have some really high quality speakers in the past over the last 5 years. And for that, we're very thankful. But that's some of the challenges we've come through. One of the bigger challenges, I think, with making connections, like I said, the time zone difference, and a lot of times, really, the challenge is understanding us explaining the benefits of International Podcast Day. Right there's 100 ways you can get involved. There's 100 ways you can plan your own event and celebrate on your own. There's a lot of benefits to being involved, both to you, to your show, to the industry, and sometimes it's a challenge sort of summarizing that and putting it in a very succinct manner, so that's why we said it's an international celebration of the power of podcast. That rings true with a lot of people. They can interpret that no matter what language you speak. And so that's some of the challenges that we've come along throughout the years.
Yeah. And before we went live, we were talking just about scheduling things. And that is something that I encounter with doing the Sunshine Summit as well, is booking people in advance and how far in advance that kind of works out to make it not an issue with, everyone's busy and we've got to try and fit these things in. And like you say, it's a lot of it's a hobby thing. So I really appreciate your time this evening to be here and everyone who's catching it live. But how have you found navigating those kinds of things, adjusting along the way?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at any large conference or event. It could be podcast related, it could be work related, whatever you're doing. There's a lot of people that do a lot of planning beforehand, 6 months, 9 months, anything like that. Our events, we've noticed in speaking with different podcasters around the world, is that they don't want anything more than like a 50 to 55 day window. Like if you try and reach out 6 months before, they're like, just contact me in 4 months, contact me in 8 weeks, And so that makes it a little bit more difficult as far as timing goes, because we're doing a lot more in a smaller span of weeks or days. But that is understanding the environment and our events and the people that we want to have on there. We're super supportive of indie podcasters, which are, as you mentioned, very flexible, very willing to donate their time, their resources to it. So we're understanding that, 60 days out is a really good time to reach out to sponsors, because that allows them to talk about the finances. It allows them to talk about timing, dedicate resources for whatever we work with them. But as far as independent podcasters and people that we ask to come on, there's usually about a 30 to 45-day window where we really can get them focused and say, okay, here's your timing. And that's just a reality of our situation. And so that can be a challenge, because I'm like a type A planner. I want to make sure that everything's smooth. If there's a cancellation, I have like 3 or 4 people in backup. That's just the nature of our event. It's the nature of individuals. But that is one of the larger challenges that we face.
Yeah. On that kind of note, American Liberty says, as Steve said, share the load. How easy has it been to find connections to assist in helping getting it all done, and your ability to relinquish control over some of the items that they might help with?
Yeah, interesting question and comment, because Steve and I have both had our own go-arounds with that stuff. There are things that I think the first 2 or 3 years, I was doing everything just on a Google spreadsheet and just emailing back and forth. Hey, does this time work? Does this time work? And that worked for me, but I was like, there's got to be a better tool out here. And Steve stepped in and is like, hey, we're going to make life a lot easier for you, a lot life easier for me. And so I was able to relinquish that as saying, okay, I'm going to use some resource technology out there to make life a lot easier. And that actually opened up the doors for me to do more things with graphics, connect a little bit more with the speakers. But it is difficult. And I think one thing, whether you're a co-host or you're working on an event in any collaborative fashion, and I know there's a lot around the world and within the United States that happens, it's about, again, finding the tools and resources and expertise and focusing on that, but then also having those heart-to-heart conversations with the people you're working with and saying, all right, this is not what this event should be about. And so we should move in this direction. We should pivot from what we're doing. And so to answer the question, it's difficult, but you, from a professional level and also a personal level, you have to be able to have that honest, approachable mindset and sort of that growth mindset where you're like, okay, it's all about creating an event, a podcast that is beneficial for listeners. And I think that's where a lot of that sort of self-reflection and ability to adapt comes into.
Yeah. So keeping the lines of communication open and being honest about what you're trying to achieve and what's working and what's not working, so you can work through those challenges, I think would be key things to have in a relationship, whether you're just podcasting or trying to create a huge event like this. Steph has a question. She said, Dave, I've only been listening to the Waves of Tech since the last International Podcast Day, and she was wondering if in the beginning episodes, if you called Steve, or if you called him Dad on air.
That is still one of the weirdest things that I ever do is I call my father Steve on air. I call him Steve when we're at podcast events, if we're at tech conferences that we're doing interviews, that when we travel together, he is Steve to me. And so it's funny because there's a lot of people that don't know that. And so when we have guests on our podcast, I'll call him Steve. And then when we go off air, I'm like, that was a good recording, Dad. And people are like, wait, what? Like, how do you transition? And it's weird. It's going to sound weird. It wasn't difficult to just do that. And it wasn't difficult for my brother when he was on it. So you kind of get into podcast mode, right? We all have our podcast voice, our podcast mode.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not difficult. It never has been, weirdly enough. And I can't say I've ever really slipped up during a podcast recording. If not, Steve has edited out because he can do that. But no, it hasn't been difficult. It's a good question. It comes up a lot. But I don't think Steve has really ever called me son on the podcast too. I mean, it may be casual conversation on the outro, but yeah, it's not, it's more common. We've got more used to it as the more episodes we've done.
She follows up with, why did you decide to do that?
That's a good question. Maybe Steve in the chat can ask us, because I think one thing is that as we've learned through listening to various podcasts, when you start using, I think when you start using like random names, not random names, I'm trying to think of the exact way to say it. When you start saying like my father or my son or this and that, I think where it builds a lot of personal relationship and touch. Steve and I have just decided to keep it more of that professional, just delivery of it. Mm-hmm. There's an understanding when you come to the show that you can tell there's some sort of connection. So I think we've allowed our connection and the way we interact to sort of speak for itself. And so it's just something we've always done. And I don't think him and I ever thought twice about doing it another way.
Yeah. The familial thing and using those kind of father-son or whatever, things that are really personal. Yeah. I think it does add an element of professionalism to it and keeps it on that kind of level. And it is what you make of it. And he said, Steve said, agree, son, or Dave.
It's true. And I think we found fun ways within the podcast to talk about what we do outside of the podcast at a more personal level. So when we're talking about tech, it's all business, right? We're talking, space, aeronautics, travel, business, social media, all those things. But then we talk about what we did on our weekends or what we're going to do in the future. We always caveat that, hey, our family is going to go down. And so I think subtly we've been able to incorporate that familial sense and of being within that podcast release. So it's definitely a fun journey. It's very interesting too.
Yeah, it's definitely a great experience being together with you both in a conversation. Like you can tell that you have the rapport with each other and that way of bouncing off each other. And it was just one of the most fun conversations I've had in a long time. And I actually had people staying with me that week, and they came back a little bit early and they could hear me laughing and how much fun I was having on your show. So I think what you do is wonderful, and the way that you share that is awesome. Steph agrees, it does. Your connection comes through loud and clear and adds to the podcast appeal. And Steve said, oh, thank you so much. Yeah. On the note of sort of wider support networks then, your family's International Podcast Day is a long event. How are they a part of it and how supportive are they?
super supportive from the start. So my wife Anea, she is actually sitting right behind me. You probably can't see her, but she's my rock. She knows that I'm very passionate about podcasting. She knows I'm very passionate about International Podcast Day. She knows that I'm very passionate. I take it seriously with making connections, building relationships, traveling to different areas, and that takes up time, right? That takes up time away from us in our relationship. But she's always provided sort of that avenue for me to create a good balance and she always helps me create an environment to release some of that stress. And I can't tell you how many times that I've come to her with a podcast question or something about International Podcast Day. It's like, hey, should we do this? Does this make sense? And she's actually been sort of that sounding board that says, maybe what do you think about this? Because it's an outsider perspective coming into it. And so for number one, her being just my number one support network has been amazing. And but also I travel up to my dad's studio for the entire event. So I'm there for close to 48 hours. And so my mom is there as well. And she's like taking care of us. She's getting us our tea and our coffee and our lunch and our sandwiches and stuff. And she's really sort of the mom that's taking care of us for it. And of course, Steve and I just independently or dependently upon each other are figuring out when to take the naps and when to take a little downtime and when to do whatever. But ultimately it's really that family of support that's really gotten us through it. And then also just speaking at the International Podcast Day level, I know that in our back pocket and in the mindset of everybody that's out there supporting is that they want International Podcast Day to be successful. And so just knowing that the industry and the community itself is the support network that we need, knowing that year in and year out, we are planning something that they want to see, something they want to celebrate. And that's anything from joining our event to creating social meetups or pub crawls to everything in between. So I think at a very personal level, it's the family, it's the friends that I keep close, but on a more global scale, a much broader scale, the community itself wants to see it succeed. And so I use that as sort of my support foundation to say, how can we improve it? What can we bring to them new and unique year in and year out? And who can we reach out to help us? And we've had a number of individuals. Daniel J. Lewis pretty much saved our event 2 years ago. He came. He's always been a part of the event, but something happened technologically. Steve and I were not the experts. He came in and saved the day, and he's been an amazing support network. And it's I don't know, it's weird. Year in and year out, it flips from people who are involved to who's not involved to podcasters that want to be involved, that want to distance themselves from it. And it's just you just have to know the audience, but having those support systems is next to none. It's super important.
Yeah, and it's amazing to have that close to home support that for your passion and helping you get through with the tea and looking after you. That's amazing. And the energy that you can draw from the wider international community who are behind International Podcast Day wanting it to succeed is incredible. Steve said, because it isn't about us, it's about podcasting. And how about when YouTube taking down their account, Dave, 1 week before the International Podcast Day stress out?
That you want to talk about a challenge, or you talk about a stressor or a support mechanism. So yeah, I inadvertently used a trademarked copyright term in one of our speaker session descriptions, and it had to do with a musical artist. And I copied, pasted, hit submit, and said, your account has been locked down for copyright infringement. And I was like, oh my gosh, what have I just done? And it was 6 days before our event. And of course, lesson learned to review and edit and do whatever as we see fit to make sure this doesn't happen. But that was a scary moment, because I thought, okay, Google is not somebody, and we talk about this on our podcast all the time, these big tech corporations, Facebook, Amazon's a little different. Google is not somebody you can call and just ask a question about, hey, what did I do wrong? How do I do this? It's the tickets, it's the emails, it's the back and forth. So there was no easy way of doing this. And fortunately, Steve was on top of it, being the tech guy that he is, was able to get it unlocked, I think within a 36-hour period. But I was sweating so much. I was so nervous. Like, we have ruined the event in 2017. This is going to be the worst thing. But yeah, that was definitely a scary moment for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can only imagine. I mean, I had some technical issues getting this embedded into the website for today, and that's been a challenge, but actually not having access to the YouTube would be very, very scary. American Liberty said, is there one thing that you would like to see as part of International Podcast Day, but is just cost prohibitive at this stage?
Cost prohibitive. I think Steve and I have always talked about doing something more on the grander scale with the studio, actually having a studio to go into and actually inviting some people in. I think it would be really cool. As far as like cost prohibitive, that would involve obviously construction, a lease, some of those things. But it'd be really cool to have sort of a central command for International Podcast Day, and but is I think that would be really cool to have. I think we would like to increase our presence doing more things virtually on our website, whether it's like using like a virtual seminar for different sponsors or different podcast services to highlight. And so I've known we actually have a really good contact, Stephen A. Hart, that does brand marketing and strategic marketing like that. And he's offered up some really cool concepts for that. But again, that takes a little bit more time, resource, energy. I wouldn't say necessarily cost prohibitive, but more like resource prohibitive, because Steve and I are pretty much the two-man team.
Mm-hmm.
We reach out when we need to. And there's one other thing I was thinking of. We've always wanted to do, because our event, International Podcast Day, is always a celebration, right? That's what it is. It's we don't like to tag it as a conference or an event or anything like that. It's not something you'd physically attend, and we've never wanted to do something like that. So we've always wanted to expand and to do a little bit more with that, both virtually. And so it's those would probably be my answer. So a few little things that we'd like to do, but just getting there has not really been a priority yet for us.
Yeah. You have sponsors for International Podcast Day, but American Liberty has asked, is there a funding assistance, like a GoFundMe type program, to help make any of those come true, like any of your bigger goals?
You know what? Steve and I have kind of bounced ideas around that. We've always been hesitant to start like a GoFundMe or even like a Patreon, because we want to stay true to our message, which is this day-long celebration of podcasting, right? And so Steve and I aren't particularly wanting to capitalize on it. As he said earlier, it's all about the industry, it's about the community rather than us. But that's something we can explore in the future. I think just like podcasters, we like to explore what's possible, what we can do, what sort of funding can we raise, what can we change as far as delivery. And but that's something that Steve and I definitely bounce ideas around off. We definitely have support for the community, so we think it's something that would be received well. But it's always interesting trying, because we started this and we thought, okay, it's all about the day, and we don't want to veer too much from that message. So one thing, as a matter of fact, to get back to his original question, I kind of blanked there, is we've always wanted to do individual tracks or separate tracks similar to a conference, so just be like, we'd have like a technical track, and we'd have like different tracks like that. But then we kind of go back and say, is that really what we're about? Is that really what International Podcast Day is about, right? We're a celebration. We're not always going to be that technical resource for you or for the community. So kind of to answer both those questions, we can consider different funding mechanisms in the future for that.
Yeah. I think that's what holds its appeal, is that it is a celebration. But in that, because it is over that span of the 29th to the 30th, or the 30th to the 31st of August, whichever time zone you're in, keeping the connections going throughout the year. You've used social media, I think, really well, and it is hard to try and keep everyone engaged throughout a whole year and up into the lead up till September the 30th. One of the ways that I've seen you do that really well is by asking incredible questions of people. And they're not too super complicated questions, but just getting in touch with the podcasting community and asking them how they're getting on, to sort of bring them in to share their stories. It's been really great to see.
Yeah, that's one thing we've really tried to do, is not just post about obviously the event or what's going on in our space, but the true sign of what we're doing is connecting, and we're celebrating. And that involves, hey, when was your biggest milestone? What was your last biggest milestone? Was your first review your last biggest milestone? Was it episode 100? Was it getting on a dream guest? Was it publishing your book? Was it you getting your first article or your website published? Like, those are the things we want to know about. We want to engage with the podcasting community, say, okay, what are your struggles? What resources are you using? And so we can sort of be that conduit to allowing those conversations to happen. And you're right, they don't have to be overly technical questions. They're just straightforward. I've asked things like, I think it was sometime in mid-April, what's the origin story of your podcast name? that was really cool because then you get to learn about who they are as individuals, what their podcast is about. And a lot of people were saying, here's the story and the origin, but this is how it played into our podcast artwork at the same time. And I thought that was really cool. And those are things that you're not going to get just on the day-to-day listening of the audio. And so we've spanned out, we've found ways to connect and reach to people that way. We've used it on Facebook, social media, Instagram, Twitter, all these different things. I think one of the most fun ones I did, Heather, and you may remember this, is I said, describe your podcast with a single GIF comment.
Yeah.
And I did that on Facebook, and that thing blew up. We had no idea, because you know how Facebook works. It's algorithm, depends on who sees what and how many people comment, all those things. And it was amazing. And it was interesting because I was able to click on all those comments, look at the GIF and be like, I know what your podcast is about. Or if I was a little confused, I go to their profile. So I was able to connect with them over there, check back. I'm like, oh, that's really clever. So finding just fun, unique ways, instead of just making it all about the podcast, making it something fun, giving them a reason to have a voice in the space.
Yeah. And it's been really cool watching those threads, and like the GIFs, you get an insight into the process they went through to create the name for their show or what their show is about, that you wouldn't necessarily get on the surface. And that's kind of what the Sunshine Summit's about too, is getting the behind the scenes, because we don't necessarily talk about the process or these kinds of things. We just create the show that we're creating, and all the rest is behind the scenes and you don't get to see it. A lot of fun seeing the threads and seeing how people interact with each other when they do participate in those things. And there's a community that can be built around that, I think, and just the passion and excitement for celebrating podcasting holds true throughout the year, which is very cool. If anyone in the chat has any last minute questions that you would like to ask Dave or myself, that would be fine. Adam from Odd Date Out podcast said, I could never find a GIF for mine. He has a saying, which is... not your specialty. No, wait, hang on. Normal is not my specialty, I think, and I'm probably going to get that horribly wrong. Sorry, Adam. But yeah, fun ways and creative ways of thinking about your show and sharing and contributing. And then there's kind of like a resource in those threads as well that people can pull up on what people have shared. And one of the questions I think you asked was about what you do if you're struggling with your podcast. So I want to ask you, what are some of your favorite nature connections that you have outside of podcasting and all of the amazing things that we do? What kind of connections with nature do you have that are important?
So my wife and I are avid hikers, and so we are blessed to be in the Central Valley of California. So we are 2 to 3 miles away from the desert, to the Central Coast, to the mountains, to a lot of national parks. And so her and I typically get out, if not every weekend, every other weekend, and we visit Sequoia National Park. We visit the Central Coast of California. We can even go just 45 minutes up the road where Steve lives and hike into the mountains up there. And so that is really our opportunity to get away from the city life, from podcasting, just to go out there. And my wife and I, we can walk for 20, 30 minutes in silence, enjoying nature, enjoying the wind, the animals, nature, everything that's out there. And it's amazing, because then we can see the mountains, we can see the desert, we can sit and put our feet in the sand and in the water, all within, a 2-hour trip, and so that's one big thing that we do. We do a lot of hiking, we do a lot of traveling as well. We just being able to go up to like the Pacific Northwest, explore some rose gardens, explore some museums, get outside, and we do take a lot of walks around our neighborhood as well, just being outside. And so that's sort of what we do to really get out there and connect with nature. We have a pool that's outside, and so when it's nice, we can go out there. We can enjoy the cool air when it's actually cool here in the city that I live in, because it's going to be 106 degrees Fahrenheit next Wednesday, which is not fun, but that's why we have our pool. But there's a lot of different ways that we go outside. Again, we hike, we swim. We try and get together with friends when they have cabins, and we go up there and we can play in the snow. We can go on like hikes. So many different things that we do for nature that just bring us a lot of joy.
That's awesome. And just tying that into, once you've wrapped up International Podcast Day, because that's a huge thing, is there anything that you've worked into your schedule or you're part of the process of how you wind down after such a big event?
Each year is very different. Sometimes Steve and I go on a social media sabbatical or even a little sabbatical from our podcast. We'll take a couple weeks off. This year's a little bit different because I actually have to go to a conference 4 days after I do the event. And so I'm like jet setting to somewhere for work related. But it's very important for us to step back. We don't ignore, obviously, the audience and sort of the leftovers from International Podcast Day. There's still people talking about it. There's still people tweeting about it. But we retract a little bit from what we're doing, get back to a little bit of balance, because it is a big 2-week push right beforehand, and obviously we're up for like 48 hours here and there. But it's a time when we really have to step back, look at what we've done, and thank the podcast community for making it so successful, and just kind of get back into it slowly. It's a long haul. It's definitely worth it, but it's all about getting like these slow progressional steps back into the space.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of those stories of connections, how you've made them, and how you work through making such an incredible event that is International Podcast Day. Steph, who is in the chat, is one of those amazing connections that I made last year when I was part of International Podcast Day. And it's incredible how active people have been in there and what they can do to support it as it's going along, but then afterwards as well, and keep talking about it and sharing the messages. American Liberty said, "Thanks, Dave, for strengthening your connection with Heather and allowing us to make one too."
Yeah, it was great. Thank you for the questions, and it's good to hear Adam from Odd Dad out there. Again, a person that we've connected with, and we stay pretty active on Twitter, at least together. But yeah, I appreciate the questions. I appreciate being able to share with your audience as far as connecting both here domestically with our podcast, but also internationally. And it's fun. It's just it's all about slow and steady wins the race. It's focusing on relationships and connections. It's finding what works for you in your audience, in your message. And obviously not overthinking connections, because we're individuals. We want to be connected. We want to be social. And I don't think that can be overstated, where we just have to look and say, hey, we're by nature, we're creatures that want to be social. And I think our industry lends a lot towards allowing that to happen.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is about being genuine and then showing the value that you see in the other people's thing, rather than sort of just all the take and what you want from other people, but giving to them first is an amazing way of just interacting and engaging with people, especially to make connections and genuine engagements that lead to amazing things like them participating in International Podcast Day. I've just got a page here which has the links. So if anyone needs to find you on social media, they can find you at INTL Podcast Day on Twitter, and the Waves of Tech is on Twitter. You've got International Podcast Day on Instagram and on Facebook, and internationalpodcastday.com. Keep an eye out, because the schedule is getting full of people who are going to be part of it coming up September 30th. And also, we didn't quite touch on it, but the Podcast Awards is going to happen on International Podcast Day as well, where if you've, I think, is the nominated voting for the finalists up yet or not? Just have listed the...
Yeah, just the listing. I believe they're going through the process right now. And so, yeah, September 29th at 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time is going to be the live announcement for the 14th Annual Podcast Awards. In the last couple of years, we've done it on International Podcast Day, which makes a lot of sense. We love award ceremonies. We love celebrating international podcasters and podcasters in general. So keep a lookout for that.
Awesome. Steve said, "Bravo, Heather and Dave. Love ya." Steph has, "Thanks, Dave and Steve, for everything that you do." American Liberty agrees. And thank you so much for being here, Dave. I really appreciate it. Everybody, I thank you for being here in the live chat, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next segment later on today. And until next time, be empowered by nature.